Hello and welcome to the Game Dev Local Podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I am on a podquest to learn everything you wanted to know about game dev but never dared to ask. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew. Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hey, Oscar. Well, thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I am the founder of Regen Marketing, where I'm a consultant and strategist and, basically helping people not just, with their marketing, but also, helping studios understand, who their audience is, how to connect and resonate with them. So you're not just getting results, but you're learning how to make connections, establish relationships with your players too.
Yeah, and I love that because my confession is that I'm also a trained marketeer. I was a member of the Chartered Industry Marketing, allegedly. I say that. I paid the first year. I never bothered paying after that. But, whilst I'm a designer and, known for talking nonsense about game dev, um, at my heart, I'm a marketeer. And I
Mm,
remember the first thing I was ever taught, which was identify and satisfy consumer needs.
yeah.
And I think that's at the heart of what I think you've just said. It's not just about marketing, whatever that means. It's not just about brand ads. It's also about understanding your audience. How well do you think people understand that?
I don't think a lot. And it's
Mm.
not like it's not saying that like, everybody's gonna have their own understanding of that these concepts and
Yeah,
whatnot. But I think what happens is systemically we see and I'm even going beyond games here, but like
yeah,
look, we engage with content online. We see billboards as we're driving by, highways and such. And we get this idea and understanding of, oh, this is what marketing is, right? This is a very
yeah,
high generalistic side of things. And then we can kind of, go a little bit deeper based off of the careers we have, the industries that we're a part of, and then we get
yeah.
another like more a little bit more detailed, but it's so much more of this just one perspective of things being in front of you in your face and stuff, and that's just a small part of what's actually going on. And through that though, we see these things and we don't necessarily think about what's kind of the human side, what is the importance
Mm.
of understanding even down to the human psychology of things and
Mm.
stuff. We just see what the end result is, and then when we start to understand and actually use it ourselves in whatever way, shape, or form, we just kind of emulate it and sometimes even just copy, kind of what we're already seeing, not realizing like, oh, there's a lot more going on to some of these billboards, or maybe there isn't. Who
Yeah.
knows? But it's about kind of like
No,
asking those right
we're
questions.
supposed to know. We're the trained
Yeah.
marketeers. We know there's more going on. And I mean, the kind of the conversation I think we're going to have today is going to be more around, because obviously you run a podcast. This is the podcast. I try and do a lot of stuff where I'm pushing my personal brand. I spent, probably 10 years of my career. I had some evangelist style role of some kind.
Mm,
So I'm very used to a broadcasting model based on my identity and authenticity, or hopefully authenticity. And I think as we've watched the evolution from old traditional media to what was once called new media is just now reality. And I think
yeah.
increasingly as we get more and more down the personal brand, the everything is content kind
Mm,
of model, I think that we end up with some really interesting debates. But I think we still will come back, and this is my prediction for the conversation. I think we'll still come back to some of the key things that drove what brands were, that drove what marketing communication psychology is supposed to be about. And I think it's also deeply embedded in game design as well. But let's see if we get to that point. So,
yeah.
tell us a bit about kind of what obviously you run a podcast as well. Tell us a bit about the podcast and what your objectives are with it.
Yeah, so the podcast that I run is called Indie Game Movement, and it's essentially about the marketing and business of indie games. So it's where I have guests. Actually, recently you were on the podcast as you alluded to before, but a lot of different guests from industry veterans,
Mm.
studio heads, even some solo indie devs,
Mm.
because as much as the podcast is about the marketing business of indie games, I also understand that there's a lot of conversations that aren't happening in the mainstream industry, and getting really focusing too on different perspectives and empathy. So I like to share with people that as much as the podcast is about marketing and business, it's the secret underlying theme that's consistent throughout is really it's about different perspectives and empathy. And
Yeah.
that's what really that the podcast is about. And kind of like you said, when people recording people giving you compliments about kind of the different perspectives that you offer.
Yeah.
I see the same type of results because it's like, wow, I didn't even think of things this way. And it's not to say anybody's right or wrong with the people that are coming on. Again, that's the whole component, is about those different
Yeah.
perspectives, and sometimes I think we need to consider those a lot more often than we do in some of the spaces that we're in.
No, absolutely. And I think, having an agenda, and I think both of us have this agenda, wanting to kind of demonstrate our expertise, but at the same time to learn more about other people's expertise in ways that we can give to a community. I think that's something we share. I think that as well as that, there is a kind of agenda to that process. I think there is in order to make that interesting, at least audience, you tell us, like,
Yeah.
comment, subscribe, all that usual stuff. But genuinely, go to the GDL gamedev local Discord and ask us questions. Because what we're trying to work out is how can we be useful, effective, and interesting. And I think the biggest crime is, well, I used to use the phrase "never sell from the stage." For my mind, one of the biggest crimes is when you simply use a vehicle like this to pitch your wares. I think people see through that immediately. I don't think it's effective. I don't think it's very good unless you're a charlatan and you're selling some kind of vitamin supplement. I don't know.
Yeah.
Am I being a bit unfair there? I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. There are those people, and then there's some that do it very effectively because they're
Yeah,
authentic, I guess, right? But it varies.
yeah, it definitely varies. So, I mean, like I say, understanding what is the point of those, kind of where I was going with that is, what is the point of creating content? Building, how do you build audiences? But probably more importantly, if you're a listener to content like this,
Mm.
how do you think, that a listener can work out which of these various forms of communication, whether it's a podcast or a blog or YouTube videos or Twitch streams, how do you think people can address what's going to actually be valuable material? How can you differentiate between the good and the bad?
Oh, that's such a great question, and it's something that I try to like process myself, like even personally, but also being mindful of other people, like, oh, the content that they consume from me, from others, and stuff.
Mm,
It's like I always like think about what's important and what's not. And the way I've, at least from my journey and from what I've learned in various different spaces in the industry and everything else, the way I look at it is it depends. And I'll expand upon that, right? Because that's
it
like,
depends.
wow,
It's a
Andrew,
great line.
thanks. Yeah.
Yeah,
But I would say it depends. But first thing I would probably consider is like, look at yourself and where you're on your journey, right? So let's put in the perspective of, you're starting a studio, you're making a game, or maybe you've been in the industry for a while and you're doing your own thing or whatever. But let's say you're starting out in some way, shape, or form. Now, you might be very excited and you have this like drive and passion to consume anything and everything and just like take it all in. And what I would say to that is, maybe that's great that you have that passion and everything. But what I've noticed, and even myself personally, is when I've been in a stage like that, I take it in, and the next thing you know, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing a little
yeah,
bit of everything, and then I'm stretching myself pretty thin. And what I've realized in time is that's not a good strategy to kind of achieve, certain milestones or objectives that I want to hit, because I'm just spreading myself too thin,
yeah,
mentally and even and else. So I would say the first thing to consider is really know where you're on your journey, and don't take everything verbatim, but but you should also, I mean, what I'm not saying is like, but on the flip side, I think that the expression, "Oh, just take it with a grain of salt," is thrown around too much, because I think
yeah,
sometimes you do need to commit to some things a little bit more than others. And then that leads into my next point, though, is to ask yourself, like, why, or what else, or what is really the intent of this, and what do I plan to get from it? Like, these are important, like, self-reflecting questions to start
yeah,
asking, because if you're like, oh, I want to do this, this, and this. Why? Because I want to go viral and get as many wishes as possible. Okay, that's okay. But then like really dive into that. Why? Like, what does that really mean?
Yeah.
What an important question I always like to ask myself personally and anybody else that I'm working with, or even just colleagues and friends is, well, what else? You gave me this thing that you want to do, but what else? And really think
The
about
phrase I like is "so what."
it. And then there's that. Like,
Yeah.
why does it matter?
Yeah.
If you're doing all this stuff, what's going to matter in the end? Is it for you, or is
Yeah.
it for someone else? And someone else, especially when it comes to players, and let's say you're trying to make a commercial product, that's a very important question to
Yeah.
consider. Because if you're doing it just for you, if you're not doing this for a hobby, but you're doing it for yourself, well, maybe you need to reconsider some things.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, for me, I think it actually comes down to that basic concept of critical thinking.
Yes,
And if
exactly.
you're thinking about critical thinking, you've got to understand that one of the points of a hypothesis or a concept is that our effort isn't to prove it. Our effort should be to disprove it. We want
Yes.
to break our assumptions. We want to question our sacred cows, and it's only through listening to diverse voices and testing some of those hypotheses, those recommendations, those suggestions, that we are able to distinguish between the valuable and the less valuable. Let's put it that way. And I think the reason why I think that's so important is because I found myself falling into the trap so many times where, because I've got to get the thing signed off by somebody, whether it's an investor or a manager or, some sort of stakeholder, my job has always ended up being caught between the need to prove if it's going to fail early and the need to get to the next milestone. And I think the risk we run, if we're not honest about what we're testing for, is that all we end up doing is doing the next thing to keep the ball rolling rather than proving what the ball that we're making is the right one.
Yeah, I love that. It's funny because as you're saying that, I'm like, and maybe it was from you, but I feel like I heard so very recently someone to say that whole concept. It's not about trying to prove, it's trying to disprove.
Yeah.
Maybe I read it somewhere. Either way, it's still a very, very valid point.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, I mean, as you were saying that, and I think recently, somewhere in my circles, I read, another studio that's, closing down, which is always unfortunate to hear. And it's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And then, but when you're saying that, I'm like, and I don't know, like we see this all too often and unfortunately, but as you were saying that, I'm like, what if that difference and how they looked at something could have made the difference in having this studio stay around, instead of like always trying to prove something, that looking at it from the different perspective of trying to disprove it. And I don't know, we could apply that to any other type of situation too, but I think it's a very important point to look at that critical side of thinking, and how just maybe flip it around. Because if we're always used to one thing and everything is done the same way, and we're saying that this is how it should be, that means that there's probably an opportunity to break out from that cycle, because that's just usually what it means. Is everybody's saying it should be done this way, it means there is an opportunity for it to be done differently, and that gets you to stand out.
Yeah, exactly. Thinking about that whole questioning process, thinking about the making good decisions, thinking about how we learn, I think again comes down to this idea of critical thinking. I mean, I found myself um, struggling sometimes when I'm trying to, for example, write an article or write a book or whatever, to find evidence that can support a thesis. When
Mm.
actually, what I really want to do is to work with some university or some institutional function or some game team to find ways to demonstrably prove that it doesn't work. So, for example, when we're looking at trying to publish a game, I'm looking to use whether it's a video trailer to get a cost per click and a day one retention, day seven retention, whatever it might be, or return on advertising spend if a game is further down the line, Or even just things like using a playtest cloud or an antidote type company to get third parties who have nothing to do with me to actually take a look at the experience and show me what's going on. And one of the things, I think it came up in our conversation, which is, it can make me sound like I'm obsessed with spending money on ads, when actually the reason why I go down that route is because I'm trying to remove my bias. I
Yeah.
think being aware of your own biases is incredibly difficult. And I think we can often underestimate how damaging that can be to the information we get. For example, when we go to a PAX or an EGX or something, we demonstrate our game.
Mm.
We can think our game is great because people keep telling us nice things about our game, but that's not a test of whether our game is any good or not.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because sometimes we think about like, oh, like I know there's a question like, well, hey, should we go to a physical event and demo the game at a booth and stuff? And there's a lot of costs and stuff and everything else. But then people are like, well, having that one-to-one feedback is great. But the other, like you called out to, the other problem to that is that bias. And you got to look at biases different ways, not only your own bias, but the bias of other people, or at least in that scenario, some people aren't going to necessarily like call you right out and be like, actually, I didn't like the game. They're like, yeah, it was fun. Or they might not say anything or whatever. I've been to those scenarios. I've helped people with booths, and you get it from all spectrums. But then in some environments, you don't get as much feedback. It might seem helpful, but again, it's just maybe doing nothing but supporting your own bias, and that can become a problem. And so the thing with ads, for example, is why I love that you shared that example, is because it does put like it's a bit more of a, I would say, more accurate type of like litmus test or something like that. You're gonna get some real solid feedback, because the it's a double-edged sword online, but the part of the
Yeah.
nice thing about it is people are gonna sometimes just give you unfiltered stuff. If they're
Yeah.
being helpful and critical about it, it's extremely helpful, and because
Very
they
much
have
so.
this mask.
Yeah. No. But the thing is, humanity means that we as society create our own masks. It's inevitable. We
Yeah.
can't help ourselves. For example, you can have the best will in the world and try to be unbiased and try to minimize, but the very fact that you are there and it is your game, we know it's been tested that that has a biased impact on the results.
Yeah.
The moment there is a measurable difference in responses when you have a third party representative showing your game compared to you showing your game.
Yeah.
And that's just one example. But the thing is, a whole bunch of other stuff. So one of the things I struggle with is there's often not a lot of data for the information that I want to present. Now,
Mm.
I've got experience, I've got understanding, and I know the theory in detail. Let's think of an example. So, I think the recent topic you raised on LinkedIn was around understanding your market, understanding your audience,
Mm.
which I think is an incredibly important kind of topic that we probably don't talk about enough. So um, are, are your players a demographic, or are they an experiential participant, for want of a better phrase? It's not quite the wording you used.
Hmm.
Um, so, when you're trying to have a conversation like that, what's motivating you to bring it up? Why have you chosen that kind of topic? And what do you think what are you achieving by raising that conversation, or trying to achieve at least?
Yeah. Well, I guess one way is, you know, I think it really stems of looking at it differently, right? Like let's
Yeah.
try to disprove this. It goes back to what we said a moment ago. Let's try to disprove this method. Not to say that it's no longer effective.
Yeah.
Especially in this case, right? Like doing high level quantitative market research is totally effective and helpful, right? But let's say but again, that question I said before, what else? Because my problem with seeing it is this is kind of the common thing that everybody defaults to. It informs everything from what they make to how they're pitching their games to publishers,
Yeah.
and it's like an industry standard. So then I was so when asking myself like what else, because I think there could be something more behind this, because what was happening with me personally, people would share this information, I'm like, this isn't really telling me anything. it's telling me high level information. That's great. You found this opportunity, but I want to know more. But yet I can't see more. Like I'm so eager to learn more about these things, but there's nothing else that you're giving me. And if I feel that way, I would imagine that publishers or other potential partners feel that way. So then I started thinking more about this too. Well, what else could there be? And a lot of learnings that I have gone on this journey was coming from the entrepreneurial space and stuff, and they have a lot of different topics that they talk about, and some of it is really, and none of this is really new. I mean, this has been around since there's a book that I have read that I love. It was written, I think, in the 1930s by Napoleon Hill, and it's called
Okay.
Think and Grow Rich. And what's mind you, if you check out this book, it is very old American English language, and there's a lot of terms in them that definitely need to be updated. But at its core, it was talking about principles and concepts of like really understanding like people and getting into really like deep stuff and really interesting things that were well established back in the 1930s, right? So
Yeah.
it's nothing new, but as we dig down, we realize, okay, well, there's gonna be other motivators outside of just games that are popular, right?
Yeah.
And so what those are that I've realized that are factors that kind of been with humans since we've been around is pain and fulfillment. And
Yeah.
then I was like looking at, well, what's the pain of players? And then when we start digging into this more, we go from what I call this concept of demand based thinking, which is using this uh, quantitative data, right,
Yeah.
and going to solution based thinking, which is going
Yeah.
into qualitative analysis and understanding what are the pains and fulfillment needs of players. How do we understand that? And that's going to help inform
Yeah.
missed opportunities, gaps in the market, and also ways that we can address it. And those are going to be the solutions.
And isn't this the kind of point though? Is like we're understanding what the different tools are offering us. For me, I love qualitative data because it allows me to understand what questions I should be asking to be able to
Right.
know what's going to shift the needle. And then I like quantitative data, so like numbers, to show how effective I am at resolving those specific variables. But that's a kind of research-led mindset. But this is what was defined, because I did my courses in the sort of early 90s, so all my marketing training was that kind of era. And this is where we were talking about not just demographics and psychographics, which was psychological kind of elements
Yep.
as well, which is useful stuff. If you're a nerdy marketing guy, go folk person, whatever, however you identify, nerdy marketing people, go check out that kind of stuff because it's really interesting. The whole idea that demographics gives us some idea of where you're positioned in a societal kind of context. Psychographics about your attitudinal views of how you interact, but then to go further and actually look about what mood and mode are. Mode being the context in which you experience something, and mood being the flavor that you're going to adopt. I mean, I'm butchering the language a little bit, so forgive me. It's been a long time since I did, but I look at mood as way effectively like a mask where you appear as if you were a different demographic because of a personal moment for you. So those functions are really useful tools. But if we haven't asked why you're doing it, we don't know the pain. How can we come up with a solution? So I think realizing that there are a lot of tools, that it is complex, but actually, if we're trying to understand a market fit for a context, in fact, maybe this is really, I think, even more fundamental than you were talking about for me, which is why aren't we doing this before we make the game? And the answer is that we want to make a game that we played previously, but we want to do our version of it, and that's fine. But that's ego talking. That's not market strategy.
Right.
We can create a market strategy for the game we want to make, and that's okay. But I think it's much more interesting, I think much more innovative, if we can sit back and say, okay, what does the market have as a gap? What's working, what's moving? Where do we think that's going to shift in 2-3 years' time? Because let's face it, that's how long it's going to take us to make those games.
Yep.
And then who wants that? Does anyone want that? What does that look like? What does that solution look like for an audience? And I think until you do what you're describing in your blog post, how can you possibly understand the questions you should be asking, and therefore how can you understand the product you should be making. And then we're back to Kotler and all of the classic marketing strategists before we even get into price and
Yeah.
promotion. And you know, I always struggle because I want to say people, and I know product, price, place, promotion is this classic, but I kind of like people instead of place. But that's another subject. Um,
But you bring up a good point though in all that, because then what you just said really comes down to understanding and defining what your intent is.
yeah,
Because if you do want to make that game that you played as a kid and just make a different version of it, again, like you said, that's okay, that's your intent there. But you also have to understand too, if you want to do that and make it a like somehow commercial success, commercial viable, however you define success, you got to understand that maybe those intents can totally align, but you also have to make sure you have to review that they do in some way, shape, or form. And another thing too is, like, I know some of the problems that some developers have is like, oh well, I'm told that I should this market is popular, but I like, let's say, horror games, but I hate
yeah,
horror, I don't want to do anything with horror, so I guess I'm just going back to the original concept of making what I want anyways.
yeah,
I get that sentiment, I clearly do, and I'm not telling you go out and make a horror game, especially if you hate them. But what I am saying, there's still going through the process that we were just talking about. There's still ways that you can go ahead and align what you want with what the market and stuff. It's a little trickier, you might have to like tailor it a bit, but otherwise there is a process involved where you can align things, and that's when it's going to be the best. Because if you that's where the intent aligns, and that's where I think a lot of this stuff, even though it's a journey, it's a roller coaster, it's gonna be a more fulfilling experience.
yeah. And I think to reinforce that point, I think there's a whole bunch of questions that come out of that in terms of, what is it? Yeah, I'll put it this way: you don't have to love horror to make horror games. In fact,
Mm,
some of the consulting I was most effective at was for football games, and I am not, I don't speak sport. But the
okay.
reason why I was useful, I think, for the teams that I work with on that space was because I wasn't, and therefore I could look at the topic neutrally. I could look at it as a
Yes.
game. And I think that understanding what you're bringing to any experience is not necessarily the obvious one. Now, don't get me wrong, if I was going to go off and do a sports game, I would have to do a hell of a lot of learning
Mm,
about what makes sports games work, not just what is that sport need. There's a lot of learning that goes with that. So having a track record, having a pattern, having a depth of understanding, incredibly useful. And I think not having somebody who is a subject matter expert on the team is a massive, massive oversight.
yeah.
But doesn't mean everybody has to be a subject matter expert. It does make it easier. I mean, if you look at Miles and Soccer Manager and those teams, they're incredible. You look at the teams that work on RuneScape, how many of them are former RuneScape players? It's ridiculous. And I mean, in a bad way, I mean, in an amazing way. What a delight that people who grew up playing that game get to work on it, and it's still a very successful game.
Mm,
And I'm thinking about my nephew, who is he does YouTube for Soccer Manager games and has done a whole bunch of stuff around the game with the team. And that to me, the development team, that to me is it shows an important level of connection with the subject matter,
mm.
and authenticity, which is kind of what we're describing here, at the same time as a depth of understanding what skills you're bringing to bear for the function. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's
So, where I'm going with this is what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to lay out that we're coming at it as people who enjoy communicating. We're creating podcasts where we're trying to talk to other people with expert status, but we're actually have an agenda, a story of our own that we want to bring to that conversation, and expertise we want to bring to that conversation. So why are we doing it? What is it? What is it we're getting out of doing things like this?
it's a good question. I mean, for me personally, and I'll be completely transparent, it's a few
Yeah,
things. The main thing that I led with was, going back, here a quick story, quick
Mm.
history of me, right? I went to film school, and while there, I realized, hey, if you want to be an independent filmmaker, you got to learn how to market yourself. Then I made a career out of marketing,
Yeah.
and then, but from that, I always loved games and stuff, and I wanted to get into the game industry because I was like, I was helping people on the side. I was working full-time jobs at agencies, and I was like, none of this is fulfilling, but I think games would be, and it definitely
Mm.
was. But as I was getting into games, I realized starting out and kind of bushwhacking your own trail, so to speak, it's tough. People will really scrutinize you if you don't come from games or coming from the outside. And it was a challenge. And one way is like, well, I want to I want to be a part of this community. I already feel like I am to a small degree, but
Yeah.
I'm a gamer, so therefore, but what else can I do to give back? And
Yeah.
how can I make it clear that I am a part of this? And the podcast is one of the best ways I could do that. And
Yeah.
in addition to that, the next thing I quickly realized with that ambition was, oh, I could learn a lot if I'm interviewing lots of other people, regardless of their status or what they accomplished or anything else. So I started looking at from that perspective of I can learn probably way faster than if I'm trying to, build up my business and work with clients and things like that. And then
Yeah.
in time, what I realized too was, oh, look at this from doing the podcast, which wasn't very structured well in terms of a cadence, right? It was like whenever I got to an episode went live, and then it was bi-weekly, and then it went to weekly. Well, the reason
Yeah.
for those changes in time was the number of guests that were coming on. A lot of them were either later doing business with me directly, they were
Yeah.
referring business to me, and then obviously, you sometimes have listeners that reach out and start business. So even from a business standpoint, it started, paying off too. But really, the sole intention behind this, and lots of other content too, but I think the podcast kind of encapsulates all of this, is that I was, I really just wanted to contribute to the community more than I could just from whatever freelance or consulting side of things that I was doing. I wanted to give back more than I knew I could learn a lot more from that process too. And then until that would more likely than not and help out with my business too. So it was really
Yeah.
leading with that intention of I want to be a part of this place.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's this is the point. I think for anyone who's looking at their career, um, not everybody is going to be extrovert or out there willing to sort of get in front of a camera. That's okay. You don't have to do it, but there is for lots of roles, in particular roles which are front facing, leadership roles in particular, but not just leadership roles, even just being able to connect with other people in other peers, it can be incredibly useful if you're willing to step up and get on a stage, get on in front of a mic and talk about what you know. It allows more people to see what you know, but also, like you said, it's not it's not the only process. It is the most obvious one, sure, but it's that ability to realize the importance of how much you learn, how you keep up to date. And for me, it's been pivotal. I host lots of shows and do lots of podcasts with people, and obviously my own as well. The only way I can keep in touch with what's going on is by participating. I'm
Mm.
a contributing editor for Pocket Gamer. What does that mean? I sit on the editorial call once a week. What an amazing opportunity to talk to the journalists who are reviewing what the current stories are that week. And my role is if they encounter something in terms of what's going on in the industry, I want to help them understand the context of it. So the fact that if I want to understand what's going on with, for example, an act today, I think is the day, or well, around now is the point where the Online Safety Act has come into force. That is going to be an incredibly complicated process for a lot of people who do
Mm-hmm.
not know how deep that's going to go yet. I wouldn't know how bad I think it's going to be had I not spent a lot of time talking to lawyers and people who are interested in regulation and other game devs who are worried about it. Someone like Andrew Wales, who I also recently spoke to, who does play Safe ID. Um, I wouldn't know that without asking the questions.
Mm. Yep.
And hopefully, this format means that not only do I get those answers, but anyone who's willing to listen to the podcast can get an insight of what else is going on. And I
Yeah.
think that's really powerful.
I do too. And you know, as you were saying that too, and realizing, you know, what I just shared a moment ago and what you just
Yeah,
shared, it was reminding me back to, I forgot which episode, but it was with Phil Nima Schwab on
yeah.
the on my podcast, and the it was something titled "How to Tackle Side Quests" or whatever,
Mm, mm,
and
mm.
because I know she's extremely busy and everything, and part of that is because of her involvement with like different organizations and
Yeah,
different things and talks and stuff. So it was really, the topic was really about that, and why is
yeah,
that beneficial, and what we're finding out and what she was explaining that episode was that through these side quests, as we called them, like just getting involved in different capacities, really helped her grow, but not just her personally, but also grow her studio. And then over time, they're no longer just a studio, they're also a studio and publisher, and there's more opportunities that are coming up because of that. And she, not 100%, I'm sure there's lots of things she attributes that to, but one factor is definitely this side quest model, which, and like you said, like, and we're always learning from these things, we're getting a pulse from different areas, which is really empowering.
yeah. No, totally. I mean, the list can go on and kind of what I think are the benefits of that from us. You know, and
Yeah.
one of the one of the lessons of being a Unity evangelist was just how important it was. Again, back to that point about never selling from the stage. You know,
Mm,
the what I feel that allowed Unity ads to be so successful in the kind of 2014, 15, 16 era was the fact that when we went out there, we were telling you how to use the tech and why in a way that was ethical and positive and about making better games. We were able to bring on players who said that they wanted these ways of engaging with games because it unlocked the potential for them to understand what the game was without having to spend upfront cash. And the game still generates revenue. Now, that was that era. There are changes to the way that ad models work nowadays. I've gone on about in other podcasts. I'm not going to bore people with that. But my point is, we took a deliberate decision to look at this as a way of informing, engaging, and making it compelling and interesting to work with us, to see us as an ally, which I think did Unity at that time. The Unity that I was part of at that time was very much about being, you know, we were developers too.
mm.
And I think that has changed, not for the better, but I'm not trying to diss on Unity. They're fine, but my issue
There's
here
just
is
a
I think
shift.
there's a shift, and that shift was inevitable because of a scaling of a company. But if you're out there and you're trying to lay out your wares, the best way to do that is to be engaging. But the best way to learn and to be able to kind of store up the goodwill is to put pennies in the bank, to give as much as you take. I think.
Yeah. You know, I love that you said that too, because it's funny. As you said, give what you take, whatever. It reminded me of the song, not really related, but New Radicals. You only get what you give, or get
Yeah,
what you give is the name of the title. But anyways, I
yeah,
mean, back to like even a little bit with the Unity. I mean, maybe it's worth like exploring that a little bit more. I mean, if you look at the concept, how you saying presenting a lot of that information and stuff. I mean, it was authentic. I'm sure it was relatable and resonating with a lot of that audience, with the people you were talking to. And what's funny is I see this happen with games a lot too, where that that type of connection doesn't always happen. And I get it. It could be a challenge to understand and think, okay, how can I form this connection in my case and in the type of
yeah,
game I'm making, right? But what I typically see a lot of times, even if that is their intent, the actions may show different. It could be like, hey, here's our game, go wishlist it, right? And I've summarized this quite significantly here, but that's kind of the impression that gets. And then when everybody else is doing the same thing, what does that look like from a player? It looks like, oh, it's just someone else asking for a wish list. And they
yeah,
become kind of numb in the sense and then the only thing that we've got going for us is if we can really produce the best content possible from a screenshot or a trailer or something. And that's usually what we only have going for us, which I'm like, well, that's too little. Like if there's a way to improve this and everything else, what would it be? And I think it's getting out of that potential, mentality, and like again asking the questions like what else can be done, how can we do things
Yeah.
differently, does what we're doing look similar at a very basic level to everybody else? If the answer is a resounding yes, then it's like how can you be different to make those connections?
And we're back to challenging our preconceptions.
Yeah,
So it does all. I mean, so whilst we're you know talking around in tangential ways, actually what we're saying is very similar. The kind of core principles that we're talking about
exactly,
critical
yes.
thinking, about authenticity, about trying to understand the problem space and to find a way to create a solution around that, is the same fundamental process that puts us in a place where we can make our careers better, we can make our products and services better, and actually the way we can make our relationships with other people and our peers more effective, not just for us but for them as well.
And yeah, exactly. And in saying that, I know there's a big problem, one of probably many problems that, developers have, which is like, um, well, they're scared of marketing because they don't want to
Yeah,
come off as salesy. And again, it goes into that like maybe cultural bias or industry bias when like the analogy I was using, when you see all these billboards and everything else, you get the impression, oh, in order to do marketing, it's this, and this is
yeah,
not doesn't coincide or align with my values.
yeah,
Therefore, I'm scared or I don't know how to approach it. It seems way too nebulous and hard to get a grasp on. Therefore, I'm going to push it off and push it off. And then thus we have one of the many problems why, games might not get seen, especially, great games that are for, specific audiences.
yeah,
So, but if we get beyond that a little bit and thinking about that's even if like you're introvert as well, that you still have connections with, just because you're not outgoing and stuff. I know lots of people I find surprisingly later that are introverts, and I'm like, but you're like one of the best people to talk to. What do you mean? And I
and do you
get
know
it,
what
but still.
the secret is? The best salespeople I've ever met were all introverts.
Ah, okay, yeah, because
that's
they're not
that's
so
the
like
thing that people don't realize.
too
I
energetic
remember
and outgoing.
a guy called Richard Moneyman, one of my former bosses, back before I even joined games.
Mm,
He was incredible because he would just sit and listen, and he
yeah.
would leave space, and he would understand. He wouldn't say anything until he'd understood what your problem was, and then he would say, "Well, we can do this, we can do that, and we can do that, and this is why you're going to pay me this."
Well, I need to share a quick story from what you just shared
Yeah,
too,
yeah,
because I think sometimes this can become a problem in certain spaces. At one of the previous jobs I worked at, there was a time when there's a lot going on, and and I took this, and I felt like in these different types of cultures, the mentality was you need to contribute. You have to
yeah,
contribute some way, and if you don't, you're looked at as weak or not smart or something. And even one time someone said, hey, when you're in these meetings, you really got to like pitch in. And I'm like, and it was conflicting for me because I'm like,
yeah.
what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to take it all in and
Mm.
see if there's anything that's I was much younger then, so maybe I would have been little bit reserved in terms of like being open and
Mm.
speaking out. But a lot of what I didn't realize at the time, but what I was doing is I was taking it in and assessing the information and then make a contribution. And I would say for anybody out there who's in that predicament, that's so important to do, because we have a problem with like just a lot of humans in general. I would say is
Yeah.
we have to be reactive. We have this idea that we have to be contributing, and the reality is you are contributing if you're taking it in. In fact, you're going to be way more effective, and down the line, people will see that and respect you for it, because that is something that is extremely valuable. Because if you're just going off of reactions all the time, guess what's really happening? You're in the business of putting out fires usually. Not
It's interesting because one of the things I found, because I think probably because now I understand it's because I got ADHD. My reaction time to information is incredibly fast. I don't mean that in an arrogant way. Just it
Mm,
means I can jump to the wrong conclusion just as fast as I might jump to the right conclusion. But the point is, I will jump to a conclusion. I will have an answer faster than most people, for good or ill. And there are some conversations where that's incredibly effective when you're being what's called a consultancy sale, where you're trying to demonstrate, or you need to demonstrate your strength of capacity. It can be really powerful, but not everybody needs that. And a lot of
Mm.
people will find that overpowering. And that's where someone like my business partner is better. And I will often defer to them to allow them to have that conversation where they will listen, they will tease out more information. Um, and I'm glad to say often I'm not completely wrong. But it's really interesting when you can double team like that, where you can actually learn from how other people will operate. But for someone like me, sitting on my hands is very difficult.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up the perspective too, because I mean, the flip side of that is what you just provided, and maybe an analogy that I'm probably going to butcher a little bit here too, but is with I know in the like the U.S. military and such,
Mm.
one of the biggest phrases like um a quick effective decision or a quick okay decision now is better than the best decision later, because
Yeah.
you're in the trenches,
Mm.
battle's going on, you can't wait minutes in some cases to make a call. So sometimes making that decision now, even if it isn't the best one, is going to be far better than taking forever to make it, because those consequences can far outweigh whatever
Yeah.
they were in that moment.
And the caveat I'd add to that is as long as you're willing to change it when you can later.
Yeah.
Because to me, course correction is so. I think if you go in with that rapid thinking, but the ego that makes you feel you're right, I think that's damaging.
Well, it just goes back to, again, the biases and that
Yeah.
reflection and that critical
Yes.
thinking process. It's like in the moment, if you have to make a quick decision, do it. But then it's like, just like you said, don't just leave it there and be like, okay, go. Because again, that could be a bad path. It's funny because as we're talking, I think we're realizing, and hopefully listeners are too. It's like there's lots of different directions. There's lots of paths that can meander. What ultimately what it comes down to is like those guiding compasses and principles,
Yeah.
and everything. Like that's why understanding your vision is so important. That's why understanding your values are, because when these nuances and different paths come up, that's what's going to keep you on the core one, that's going to help you get to the destination that you're looking to do, and
And I
reevaluate
love
and
that.
pivot if needed.
Exactly. And I think for me, it brings us back to that first question. Whenever we're doing kind of mentoring stuff, I try and get people to answer, which is, what does success look like?
Mm.
And until you can answer that, you can't put a number to it. If you can't put a number to it, you can't then decide what is it going to take to get to that level of success. Like, who is the audience, and put some numbers and some data behind that. What do they want? What's the solution that's going to satisfy them? And put some numbers against whether it did satisfy them or not. Those, this application of the rationale, so the solution thinking you were describing in your recent article, and data allows us to be quicker responding, to be clearer in our definition, but only when we've started with the fundamental understanding of what success looks like.
Yeah, like that understanding of what success, like how you defined it, like going again back to your intent, your why, and why
Yeah.
and why you're doing these things, and then aligning that with those other aspects. I mean, what it ultimately does is the more you understand about yourself, your team, the audience, and obviously the project, then the more clarity you're going to have. So you have that guiding compass, and then you have clarity. So then, and this is the part that I think a lot of us miss, because, a lot of the information out there that I see is very tactical. It's about the how, how do you
Yeah.
do this? How do you do that? And that information is still necessary and helpful. But if you
Yeah.
don't have that proper understanding of the why, right, then you're not gonna be able to execute the how with clarity.
Exactly. And it's one of those weird things, and I think feeds back into why we make podcasts. Again, that kind of point of where we're going with this. I make podcasts to try and communicate the whys that I've learned and to learn more. But I know I'm terrible at remembering where the specific game or specific mechanic or specific person who did those things were. But I don't need to, because if you did go into that specific person, that specific mechanic, a specific game, you would see other things that did not amplify the particular point that I'm trying to get
Mm,
across. So I've chosen my style to be generic, to focus on the levers rather
yeah.
than the detail. But what I think is delightful is when you see other people out there doing their versions where they can remember the specifics. They talk about the
Mm,
detail about that particular game or that particular kind of way of thinking. And I think that brings us back to this point, which is different voices delivering different levels of information. And the more we can absorb, the more rounded our opinions and perspectives will be.
yeah, absolutely. Because that overall, like, the specifics are helpful, but so are the generalizations. Because I think that combination is what is going to allow us, as we're learning these things, wherever we are in our journey, it's going to allow us to apply our unique perspective or our own perspective to that, and then make the most with that information. Because if we just
Absolutely.
look at one or the other, it's not going to be as helpful.
Absolutely. So, let's wrap this up in a nice little package. If you were to advise somebody who was thinking about maybe making their own podcast or thinking about how they would do more to market themselves, what would be the piece of advice you would give them?
I guess I've said it a few times before, but really get behind the understanding of your intent for that. What is it?
Yeah.
And regardless of what it is, just make sure you understand, and then ask, well, what else? Again,
Yeah.
that's it's a phrase I learned from a book I can't remember the title of, but it's such and maybe share later, but it's such an important consideration and self-reflection and doing that, because it will start uncovering so much more. So
Yeah.
anybody starting out with whatever your endeavor is, I would say identify that intent, and then start breaking that intent down for what does it mean for you, like, and then asking who is your audience, like all these other
Yeah.
things. And
Well, there's the line. I think. Well, I'm not sure if it's the one you're thinking of, but the one that immediately comes to mind for me is the 5 whys. That's the technique that you basically ask why, and then you don't just accept your first answer. You ask again why, and then you go deeper
yeah,
and
i've
deeper.
seen i've seen that
Yeah.
process before too, but
Yeah.
yes, it's very, very similar to that. And but in whatever capacity or way that you're doing that, it's just so important. There's so many great resources that help you discover your why and your intent and everything
Yeah.
else. um but that's really going to help you guide every other step of the way, because again, then when you get to the actual execution, yes, you're going to hit like maybe another wall for a minute, like what do I do next and stuff.
Yeah.
But if you have those understandings and principles, at least when you get over that hurdle, you're going to have a lot more clarity than if you didn't have those things defined. And I've seen this multiple times myself. I tried to start up lots of different websites before for various things, and when I didn't understand the why, or how much another factor is, what's a driving factor or motivator behind me with it, which does relate to this why, this intent, you can maybe see fairly quickly if this is going to produce something that's worthwhile and fulfilling or not, rather than spending time and energy on a project and then realizing like 5 years 5 months, years down the road that, oh, I guess it kind of fizzled out, and I'm trying to figure out the next thing.
Yeah.
The more you know how to do that and understand that intent first, I would say the better off you're going to be. And it's something we don't look at as much as I think we should
Yeah.
be, at least with the type of lens.
And the nice thing about that is if we understand our why when we start, if we find out it's not working, that's when we can pivot. We still got this guiding star that
Exactly.
allows us to understand how we pivot within the new information. I always liken it to Neverland. Neverland is always the second star to the left and straight home till morning. It is a direction. It is not a destination.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, you couldn't have said it better, because that's so important. Because even when you're in moments of pivoting, if you know, like, what is that main thing about you or your team that you really want to strive for, when you have those hurdles or find out, oh, a situation where we have to abandon this project, we have to shut it down or whatever, at least everything else is still going to direct you in that right way. So when that does happen, or if those moments happen, It's more of not like I don't know what else to do next now because I'm stuck. It's more of I have a direction, so at least I have that can get me right back on my feet.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for that. If people want to find out more about what you do or more about your podcast, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So, for anyone who does listening to podcasts, which I hope you do if you're here, you could, Indie Game Movement is the name of the podcast, and you can listen to it anywhere that you listen to podcasts. So, Spotify, Apple. It's also available on my website, which you can also find out more about what I do, and that is rengenmarketing.com. There's a navigation bar that has the podcast and some other links and resources. And I'm on LinkedIn. So you could just look up Andrew Pappas. I think it's Andrew Pappas for Regen or whatever. Find me there. Oscar has
And
shared
we'll put some in the
lots
show
of
notes.
content.
Don't worry.
Excellent. And then last thing I'll share now is haven't launched this yet, but I am working on a new newsletter that is focusing kind of a lot of the things that we talked about here today and other things that similar things that I share on LinkedIn. And it's a newsletter called Decoding Impact. And it's about understanding the why, executing the how, and delivering impact. So if that sounds something interesting, sign up. It's still in the works, but there is a sign up form. And yeah, will be just more the type of stuff that I share on these other channels.
By the time this goes out, that might well be out there. So hopefully it will all be out soon. So Andrew, thanks again. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. Hopefully got you thinking about. We've been particularly talking about the kind of the roles that our podcast efforts have been taking us, about our own personal journey of talking about what we know, what we share, how we learn, and the importance of that. But I think what I've also hope we gained out of that is to look at why that works in the context of understanding audiences and delivering information, but also how we can then use that to build strategy, to think about what success looks like, and to be able to deliver better experiences, whatever role we're doing. And on that note, please, again, like I say, like, subscribe, share, follow, whatever else it might be. And also check out the Discord. There's a great community of people on Discord and Game Dev Local. You can find out more about what's going on and ask questions. And there'll be people like me out there wanting to talk more on the subject. So until next time, this has been your Game Dev Local podcast.